guys, it's me, Whitney Moore. As some of you know already, I'm a big fan of metal, and I think that everyone should at least give it a chance. Now, I know you might be postulating, why is this on SourceFed Nerd? To which I say, nerdiness has run in the blood of metal since the very beginning. D&D, fantasy, and sci-fi stories like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, Norse mythology, the cosmos themselves have all been common themes in metal since the beginning. I'm gonna go over a bunch of different styles today, but one of the things I think is so cool about metal is no matter what subgenre you're talking about, there's probably a band that sings about all the nerdy shit that we love. It can be sort of an intimidating genre to try to get into. There are so many subgenres, and even a lot of metal fans can't agree on what is actual metal and what is poser trash. So here's my little beginner's guide you can use to navigate the different kinds of metal so you can decide which you'd like to listen to and also sound super knowledgeable in front of your friends. Let's start with heavy metal since it's been around the longest and it includes most bands that someone who isn't very familiar with metal would probably recognize. In the 60s and 70s, bands like Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and even Led Zeppelin took the psychedelic acid rock of the time and made it heavier and louder. And like any musical genre that takes the world by storm, heavy metal inspired new subgenres in response to that. In the late 1970s, bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard helped start the new wave of British heavy metal music, a style that infused the metal of the time with a faster, more aggressive sound and a punk rock sensibility. Around the same time, sex-soaked glam metal was also hitting the scenes with bands like Kiss, Van Halen, and Alice Cooper. With the advent of MTV in the 1980s, people wanted to watch more music videos, and so the ones with the flashy clothes, crazy hair, and makeup became more mainstream than the low-budget DIY style of the new wave of British heavy metal. With the popularity and subsequent commercialization of heavy metal in the 1980s, there was a rising underground scene that opposed the over-the-top fashion and poppy hooks of hair metal. Thrash metal was born in response with a faster tempo and a more aggressive overall sound. The English band Venom was said to pioneer thrash metal, and popular mainstays like Metallica, Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth all were influenced by them. As nuanced as each of these subgenres are, they all fall under the umbrella genre that is heavy metal or classic metal. These bands became pillars of what would become all uniquely different subgenres of metal. It can be difficult to place current metal bands because they all borrow from each other, but now I'm gonna get into contemporary metal styles that you might not be as familiar with. But before I do that, I'll finish up the history lesson so you have some context. As I understand it, there is an interesting fork in the road as to what happened during and immediately after thrash metal became a thing. Remember Venom? Well, in 1982, they released an album called Black Metal that, even though it inspired a bunch of very popular thrash bands, it also had such an influence on the underground thrash scene that an entirely new genre of metal was born from it. Enter black metal. See, even though Metallica and Slayer were considered to be evil and brutal, it was becoming mainstream. You can't really be part of the counterculture if you're commercial, can you? During the 90s, these behemoths of thrash became more radio-friendly and black metal became more extreme. Norwegian bands like Mayhem, Darkthrone, Emperor, and Gorgoroth helped to solidify the characteristics of black metal. Heavily distorted guitars, high-pitched shrieking, lo-fi recording, and a general atmosphere of dread and terror. Like this. Any metal nerd will tell you that these bands are part of the second wave of black metal since they followed in the footsteps of bands like Venom, Merciful Fate, and Bathery, but made it into a distinct genre hell-bent on misanthropy. Being anti-religion was a particularly potent statement during this time in the 1980s because the whole world was consumed with something known as the satanic panic, an almost McCarthyism level of paranoia that there was some hidden evil lurking in all of entertainment, especially in some of the nerdy stuff we love that I mentioned earlier, that would strip your family of its good Christian values. So because the goal of black metal is to remain as counterculture as possible, you get a lot of extreme anti-religious lyrics, and what follows is some incredibly extreme behavior done for the sake of good old nihilism. Black metal is definitely the heaviest and darkest genre of metal, but because its very existence is focused on being the heaviest and darkest people around, historically what you get is basically a bunch of goths dressed up like corpses trying to out-edge each other to the point of burning churches down and literally murdering one another. Black metal has a sordid history at best, and at worst one associated with a lot of crime and racism. It's an interesting phenomenon. Few black metal fans would argue that they actually believe in Satan, and yet historically, people in the culture are so dedicated to all that is considered evil and terrifying that the lines kind of seem to blur. One of the most notorious bands in metal history for this kind of behavior is a Norwegian band called Mayhem. Their story is so essential to the culture of black metal that there's actually a movie being produced about the members directed by the fantastic director Jonas Åkerlund, who himself was a drummer for the black metal band Bathery. The movie is going to star pop sensation Sky Ferreira, which I'm sure you can guess a lot of dedicated black metal fans fans are not too happy about. Black metal can be a challenge to get into at first, but if you're in the mood for something heavy and dark on a winter's day, you can't really do any better than popping on some Dark Fortress and letting the hate flow through you. There's plenty going on in the world that can get you into a nihilistic mood, and black metal is the way I like to cope with that. Side note, classic black metal is always good, but there are some really great current bands that can be relatively hard to find. I recommend following my favorite music editor, Kim Kelly, at GrimKim on Twitter, because that's her specialty. I just found a band called Blood Incantation from one of her album reviews, and it's been one of my favorite albums to come out of last year. Death metal, probably my favorite subgenre, was another type of extreme metal to be born from thrash in the 90s. It's a little less challenging to listen to than black metal, since a lot of death metal bands skew slightly more melodic, though it keeps a lot of the violent and satanic themes of black metal. The difference there is that death metal, in my opinion, takes itself less seriously and aims to be more like a horror movie than a smut flick. Basically, if black metal is scary, death metal is like its spooky cousin. Another difference is death metal vocals are referred to as death growls, which is a lower, more guttural alternative, like this, to the high-pitched scream of black metal, like this. Though some bands, of course, like to mix it up. Death metal has become a hugely varied subgenre of metal that sort of bleeds into other subgenres. My favorite death metal band, Skeleton Witch, skews a little more to the thrash side of things. Another favorite, called Hoth, yes, like the ice planet, falls into the category of melodic death metal because it features beautiful instrumentals, and Atlantis Chronicles seem to take some inspiration from power metal. What's power metal, I pretend to hear you say? I'm so glad you fake asked, because it too started with roots in speed metal but then diverged completely. Instead of taking some of the satanic themes of speed metal and making them darker, power metal took some of the existing fantasy themes already present in metal and leaned into it heavy. Power metal is pure, uplifting, very nerdy fun that features anthemic songs with high sing-along value, like this. For the king, for the land. It's bar none the best kind of music to listen to when you want to feel like a badass knight slaying dragons in magical kingdoms and going into battle with your sword that has been forged in Valhalla and blessed by the gods. Basically, great energizing music and very fun to play Skyrim to. Most of you have probably heard of Dragon Force because of their song Through the Fire and Flames, making it onto Guitar Hero 3, and if you like that song, I recommend you check out the album Symphony of Enchanted Lands by Rhapsody. Okay, so we've covered classic heavy metal, speed metal, thrash metal, black metal, death metal, and power metal. Those are probably the biggest genres out there, but trust, there are a ton more. One that has always been a mainstay in my music library is doom metal, which has plenty of its own subgenres, but it's characterized by heavy, thick-sounding guitar that's been tuned way down, like this. It's loud, generally slow, and can range in vocal styles from epic and clean to gritty and guttural. If you find yourself becoming a fan of power metal, there's power doom. If you prefer something darker, there's black doom, there's also funeral doom, sludge doom, drone doom, and death doom to suit a variety of tastes. I personally am a big fan of stoner doom bands like Sleep, Electric Wizard, and Weed Eater, not only because I like any art that describes psychedelic exploration, but also there's an inherently meditative nature to the droning, heavy waves that wash over you. Try that on for size next time you want an alternative to your normal relaxing music. It's also wonderful background music for when you're working. I was listening to Sleep's Holy Mountain when writing this part. The last distinct subgenre of metal that I'm gonna go over today is progressive metal, and it's not really my cup of tea, but it's still an important one to note because there are a lot of huge bands that fall in this category. It can also be argued that prog metal is some of the most impressive music out of the bunch, since the key characteristics are technicality and theoretical complexity. Here's an example. Prog metal is also generally influenced by classical and experimental music, and it's not uncommon for these bands to borrow from jazz music with extended solo sections. If you're looking into prog metal, you might hear or see the word gent come up, and that's an onomatopoeia to describe the palm-muted power chords that are used a whole bunch by the bands in this genre. Here's YouTuber Jared Dines showing the difference between gent and shredding. Progressive metal bands can vary a ton, but if you're into experimental stuff in general, check out Dream Theater or Meshuggah. So those are the basic subgenres of metal, but really it's only the tip of the cold, brutal iceberg. New subgenres are being born out of each different style all the time. You've got folk metal, metalcore, gothic metal, industrial metal, and I will mention nu metal, even though it's not really metal. And if you listen to any band that calls itself metal but also uses a turntable, you should be slapped. Also, screamo is not metal. Don't you dare say you're into metal if you're wearing a damn Asking Alexandria shirt, okay? Okay. If you've watched watched this entire thing, it must mean you have a curiosity about metal, and I thank you for wanting to learn about it. I really believe that there's something out there for every type of musical taste, so if you try something you're not particularly jazzed about, there is always another completely different sound waiting for you. If you're off put at all by the screaming and growling at first, I recommend looking at the vocals as just another instrument to add atmosphere to the music instead of words being the focal point of the song. Metal can also be hugely cathartic if you're feeling angry. I know when I'm in a down mood, it's so comforting to listen to something broody and thrashy and heavy is how I feel. But it's also great music to get pumped up to, see power metal, or chill out to, see stoner metal. Maybe the thing I like the most about metal though is that it fully embraces something that is totally human, and that's darkness. Some of the happiest people I know are metalheads, and I think that's because they know it's not unhealthy to be fascinated by ugliness or evil, and it's important not to shy away from your emotions even if they are scary. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my passion with you, and if you do end up checking out any of these bands, or if you're already a bona fide metalhead, let me know what you're listening to in the comments. I'm Whitney Moore, and I'll see you next time. Hey, and hail Satan. I'm a huge Resident Evil fan. I've played all of them, and I'm so freaking excited to test out the new one. I hope I pee my pants. The smash hit RPG Final Fantasy is back and bigger than ever, so I figured I'd dive right in and see what all the fuss is about.